Forget the Navy SEAL. Save the World Cup final. Security Chief Marcus Hayes thundered across the trauma bay, his voice cutting through the alarms as agents, doctors, and tactical officers froze for a fraction of a second. A young nurse no one seemed to recognize looked up from the wounded man on the gurney, met the chief's eyes without flinching, and quietly answered with a single word. No, the room stopped breathing. Outside, 70,000 fans roared inside Liberty Stadium as the World Cup final counted down toward kickoff. Inside St. Matthew Medical Center, every second carried a different kind of clock. The man lying on the stretcher wore no name badge anyone could see, only torn tactical gear hidden beneath a blood-stained security jacket and a faded bracelet stamped with the trident of a Navy SEAL. Secret Service agents crowded the doorway while stadium security radios erupted with frantic voices warning of possible coordinated threats if the championship security detail remained compromised. Marcus Hayes stepped closer, jaw clenched. "Nurse, you don't understand what's at stake. We lose that stadium, we lose everything." The young woman never raised her voice. She pressed 2 fingers against the patient's wrist, watching his breathing instead of the people shouting around her. "If he leaves this room," she said calmly, "you lose him." Several senior physicians exchanged irritated glances. Someone whispered that the rookie had been working in the emergency department for less than a week. Another muttered that she should be documenting charts instead of challenging the city's highest-ranking security official. Nobody noticed her eyes moving from the patient's fingertips to the monitor, then to the barely visible discoloration beneath his collarbone. She reached for an ultrasound probe before anyone requested one. "Who authorized that?" one attending physician snapped. Emily Carter didn't answer. She was already sliding the probe into position with practiced precision, her movements smooth enough to silence even the nearest trauma technician. The screen flickered to life. Emily's expression changed by less than an inch. "He's compensating," she said. Quietly. "Not stable." The attending frowned at the monitor, seeing nothing unusual. Marcus Hayes slammed a hand onto the counter. "Enough. We have helicopters waiting. The final begins in less than an hour." Emily finally looked at him. "Then you still have time," she replied. Before anyone could argue again, the patient's breathing shifted almost imperceptibly. Emily reacted instantly, adjusting the stretcher before the monitor could register the change. A nurse standing beside her blinked in confusion. "How did you know?" Emily didn't explain. She simply repositioned the oxygen line, checked the patient's pupils, and asked for equipment that no one else had considered preparing. The respiratory therapist handed it over almost automatically, as though responding to someone who had led trauma rooms for years instead of someone who still wore a temporary employee badge. The monitor stabilized. Only then did the numbers begin changing exactly as Emily had anticipated nearly 20 seconds earlier. A silence spread through the room that felt heavier than the alarms. The attending physician stared at the screen, then back at Emily. "Lucky call," he muttered, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Emily ignored the comment. Her attention never drifted from the patient. As she adjusted the blanket, the edge of her scrub sleeve lifted just enough to reveal a thin pale scar running across her forearm before disappearing beneath the fabric again. One of the older paramedics standing near the supply cabinet narrowed his eyes for only a heartbeat, as though the movement had awakened a memory he couldn't quite reach. Marcus Hayes looked toward the waiting agents gathering outside the trauma room. Stadium security was collapsing into confusion by the minute, and every instinct told him the championship had to come first. Yet the rookie nurse everyone had dismissed less than 10 minutes earlier had already predicted a deterioration before sophisticated monitors had caught it. He had come prepared to overrule an inexperienced ER nurse. Instead, for the first time since walking into the hospital, he found himself wondering a far more dangerous question. Who exactly was Emily Carter? Marcus Hayes looked from the monitor to the clock mounted above the trauma bay entrance. 52 minutes until kickoff. Every radio clipped to every tactical vest in the room crackled with overlapping reports from Liberty Stadium. Security checkpoints were backing up. The protective formation assigned to international officials had already been reshuffled twice. A supervisor's voice broke through the static. "Chief, We cannot hold this configuration much longer. Hayes closed his eyes for half a second before pointing toward the gurney. Package him for transport. We stabilize him on the way. The attending physician nodded immediately. Understood. Emily Carter did not move. She kept watching the patient's breathing, counting each rise without looking at the monitor. He will not survive that ride, she said quietly. The physician frowned. His blood pressure is acceptable. Emily reached toward the ultrasound again, but another doctor stepped between her and the machine. Enough. We already have imaging. Emily did not argue. Instead, she gently lifted the patient's left hand and studied the fingertips for barely 2 seconds before placing it back on the blanket. His pressure is only acceptable because his body is compensating, she said. That compensation is ending. Several staff members exchanged skeptical looks. One resident whispered that the rookie was becoming dangerously confident. Marcus Hayes folded his arms. You have 10 seconds to explain. Emily shook her head. There is no time to explain. She pointed toward the patient's neck. Watch. Every eye turned toward the injured operator. For 3 silent seconds, nothing happened. The attending physician exhaled in visible frustration. Then the patient's breathing became noticeably shallower. The cardiac monitor changed almost simultaneously. The blood pressure that had appeared steady only moments earlier began drifting downward exactly as Emily had predicted. The resident stared at the screen before instinctively checking the intravenous lines, searching for equipment failure that was not there. Emily was already adjusting the oxygen flow and asking for a pressure bag. Her voice never became louder. Faster. The respiratory therapist handed it over before the attending physician even approved the request. Nobody questioned why. They simply reacted to the certainty in her tone. Within seconds, the downward trend slowed. The monitor steadied again. The physician looked at Emily, confusion replacing irritation. How did you catch that before the monitor? Emily secured another line without looking up. The monitor measures numbers. People change first. Before anyone could process the answer, another alarm echoed through the emergency department. 2 security officers rushed into the trauma bay, pushing a second patient from the stadium perimeter. The hallway erupted with fresh activity. Every available physician instinctively shifted toward the new arrival. Marcus Hayes looked torn between 2 emergencies unfolding at once. Emily glanced only once toward the second stretcher before returning to the Navy SEAL. He stays priority 1, she said. The attending physician stared at her in disbelief. You have not even seen the new patient. Emily answered while tightening a blood pressure cuff. I did. The physician blinked. For 1 second. Emily nodded. That was enough. Her confidence irritated him even more. Absolutely not. We follow triage protocols, not guesses. Emily stepped aside without resisting. Then evaluate him. The physician crossed the room toward the incoming patient. Less than a minute later, his pace slowed. He looked back toward Emily with an expression that no longer carried annoyance. The second patient was frightened, injured, but stable. Emily had been right again. Nobody celebrated the realization. Instead, an uneasy silence settled over the trauma bay. The older paramedic who had noticed the scar earlier watched Emily prepare supplies in a sequence that felt strangely familiar. She arranged every instrument in an order he had only seen once before, years ago, during a federal disaster response exercise led by instructors whose names had never appeared on official schedules. He opened his mouth as if to ask something, then stopped himself. Marcus Hayes noticed the paramedic's reaction before he noticed the instruments themselves. What is it? He asked. The paramedic hesitated just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Probably nothing, he answered, though his eyes never left Emily's hands. It is just, I have seen someone work like that before. Hayes followed his gaze toward the rookie nurse, who quietly checked each piece of equipment one final time without acknowledging the conversation around her. At that exact moment, the unconscious Navy SEAL's hand twitched weakly against the blanket, his fingers closing around Emily's wrist for only an instant before releasing again, and in a voice so faint that only those closest to the bed could hear, he whispered 2 words that made the paramedic's face lose its color. The whisper was barely audible, but it hit the older paramedic like a physical force. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the unconscious operator instead of Emily. Falcon, the wounded man murmured before the sound dissolved into another shallow breath. The paramedic's shoulders stiffened. Marcus Hayes caught the reaction immediately. What did he say? The man hesitated. I am not sure. He looked toward Emily, searching her face for recognition. She gave none. Instead, she gently repositioned the patient's arm as the heart monitor began tracing an irregular rhythm. Another alarm joined the chorus, echoing through the emergency department. The attending physician glanced at the screen and reached for medication, but Emily stopped his hand before he could administer it. Wait. The physician frowned. His rhythm is changing. Emily nodded. Exactly. She leaned closer to the patient's chest, listening through her stethoscope, while everyone else watched the monitor. 5 long seconds passed. The physician's patience disappeared. We are losing time. Emily quietly lifted the oxygen mask just enough to hear one more breath, then replaced it. Not medication, she said. Position. Without waiting for approval, she tilted the bed a few degrees and asked the respiratory therapist to adjust the ventilatory support. The therapist looked toward the attending physician, who reluctantly gave a short nod. Within moments, the irregular rhythm settled. The medication syringe remained unopened. The physician stared first at the monitor, then at Emily. That should not have worked. Emily secured another line without looking up. It would not have if we treated the monitor instead of the patient. Nobody answered. Even Marcus Hayes remained silent. The room had begun moving differently around the rookie nurse. People still questioned her, but they no longer ignored her. A trauma technician quietly rearranged supplies exactly where Emily reached for them before she asked. Another nurse prepared additional equipment without receiving instructions. Nobody had consciously decided to follow her. It simply happened. The older paramedic continued watching every movement she made. She checked each instrument with the same economical precision. She folded sterile packaging into neat squares before discarding it. She never turned her back completely toward a doorway. Tiny habits, ordinary by themselves. Together they stirred memories he could not fully place. Where did you train? He finally asked. Emily did not stop working. Nursing school. The answer was technically complete, yet somehow empty. Before anyone could press further, the patient's oxygen level drifted downward again. This time the attending physician looked directly at Emily instead of making the first decision himself. What are you seeing? It was the first time anyone had asked instead of argued. Emily studied the patient's shoulders, then the monitor, then the intravenous tubing. Her eyes settled on the barely visible swelling beneath the collarbone she had noticed earlier. The problem is getting worse. Can you prove it? The physician asked. Emily reached for the ultrasound probe once more. No one blocked her path this time. She moved the probe slowly across the upper chest. Gray shadows shimmered across the screen. Most people in the room saw only indistinct shapes. Emily remained completely still for nearly 10 seconds before tracing one location with her finger. There. The attending physician leaned closer. His expression changed. I missed that. Emily quietly stepped aside so he could confirm the finding himself. He repeated the scan from a different angle. The same image appeared again. A treatable complication had been developing exactly where Emily predicted. Had they loaded the patient into a helicopter 20 minutes earlier, the flight itself might have turned a difficult rescue into an impossible one. Marcus Hayes slowly lowered the radio he had been gripping. For the first time since entering the hospital, he said nothing. His certainty had begun giving way to doubt. Outside, another wave of cheers rolled across the city as fans poured toward Liberty Stadium. Inside the trauma bay, every person now looked at Emily Carter differently. Not with admiration. Not yet. With questions. The older paramedic glanced down as Emily reached across the patient for another instrument. Hanging beneath the collar of her scrub top, hidden for only an instant before slipping back beneath the fabric, was a thin silver chain carrying something small and worn. It was not jewelry. It looked old. Military old. Before he could see the markings, the trauma room doors burst open and a federal protective agent hurried inside carrying a sealed black case, marked with a government security seal. He scanned the room once, stopped the moment he saw the unconscious Navy SEAL, then unexpectedly turned toward Emily as though he had almost mistaken her for someone else. The federal protective agent did not waste a second. He carried the sealed black case straight toward Marcus Hayes, but before either man could speak, the cardiac monitor sounded another warning. Emily Carter was already moving. She caught the slight change in the patient's breathing before anyone else looked away from the agent. "Hold the case," she said without raising her voice. "He cannot wait." The room hesitated. Every eye shifted between the government SEAL and the unconscious Navy SEAL. Marcus instinctively reached for the case, but Emily had already lowered the head of the bed by a few inches and repositioned the patient's shoulders with deliberate precision. "What are you doing?" the attending physician asked. Emily did not answer immediately. She watched the patient's face instead of the monitor, then gently adjusted the intravenous tubing that crossed beneath his arm. "He is telling us something," she said quietly. The physician frowned, hearing only alarms. Emily listened to a single breath through her stethoscope, then asked for another ultrasound scan. This time nobody questioned the request. The technician handed her the probe before she finished extending her hand. The image appeared almost instantly. Emily traced a small area on the screen with one finger, then stepped back. The attending physician repeated the scan from the same angle. His expression tightened. The complication had shifted exactly where Emily anticipated, changing the treatment plan without changing the diagnosis. "If we had moved him 5 minutes ago," he whispered. He never finished the sentence. Marcus Hayes looked at the monitor, then at Emily. For the first time since entering the hospital, he stopped giving orders. Instead, he watched her work. The federal agent remained standing beside the trauma bay door, still holding the unopened case. He studied Emily with growing curiosity. She never once glanced at the government SEAL. She never asked who he represented or what was inside. Her entire attention remained fixed on the patient. The agent lowered the case slightly, almost unconsciously, as though recognizing priorities without being told. Across the room, the older paramedic continued observing details nobody else seemed to notice. Emily always kept one shoulder angled toward the entrance. She instinctively left a clear path between the bed and the exit. Whenever someone crossed behind her, she shifted only enough to maintain awareness without interrupting her work. None of those movements belonged in any nursing handbook he had ever read. They were habits carried by repetition, not instruction. He caught himself mirroring one of her positioning adjustments before realizing what he had done. The realization unsettled him more than the movement itself. Another burst of radio traffic shattered the brief calm. "Chief, security perimeter is changing again. Protective teams are requesting immediate confirmation. We cannot delay any longer." Marcus pressed the transmit button but hesitated before speaking. The silence lasted only 2 seconds, yet everyone noticed it. He looked toward Emily instead of answering the radio. "How much time do you need?" The question surprised even him. Emily checked the patient's pulse once more. Enough to keep him alive. She did not promise success. She did not ask for trust. She simply returned to work. The attending physician drew a slow breath and quietly redirected 2 residents toward Emily's station instead of assigning them elsewhere. No announcement was made. No authority changed hands. Yet the flow of the trauma room shifted around the rookie nurse as if experience, rather than rank, had become the center of gravity. The federal agent finally stepped forward with the black case. "Chief Hayes," he began, "these updated security protocols require immediate." He stopped mid-sentence. Emily had reached across the bed to stabilize a monitor cable before it slipped free, and for a fraction of a second the sleeve of her scrub top pulled back just enough to reveal a faint pattern of evenly spaced marks circling her wrist. They were not tattoos. They looked more like old pressure impressions left by years of wearing the same piece of equipment in exactly the same place. The agent's eyes lingered for only an instant before he looked away, his expression changing from routine professionalism to quiet uncertainty. He said nothing. Neither did Emily. But when he resumed speaking, his tone had changed completely. "Chief, I think these protocols can wait another minute." Before Marcus Hayes could respond, every light inside the trauma bay flickered once. Then the emergency backup system engaged with a low mechanical hum. plunging the room into the harsh glow of backup power as someone shouted from the hallway that the entire hospital had just lost its primary electrical supply. The backup generators roared to life, but only half the trauma bay responded. One monitor remained dark. 2 ceiling lights stayed dead. The ventilator switched to battery mode with a sharp warning tone that immediately changed the room's priorities. The attending physician looked toward engineering. How long until full power returns? Nobody answered. Marcus Hayes grabbed his radio, but the emergency channel was drowning beneath simultaneous reports from Liberty Stadium, City Dispatch, and hospital security. Emily Carter never looked up. She had already disconnected one portable monitor from an empty trauma station and wheeled it beside the unconscious Navy SEAL before anyone suggested doing it. Battery at 68%, she said after one glance. That gives us enough time if we stop wasting it. The respiratory therapist instinctively followed her instructions. The attending physician did the same without realizing he no longer questioned them. Then another problem appeared. The hospital information system failed to reconnect. Laboratory values disappeared from every screen. Imaging archives vanished. Every electronic record inside the trauma bay went blank. The physician exhaled sharply. We just lost the chart. Emily quietly reached beneath the stretcher, removed a black marker from a supply tray, and began writing directly onto the disposable trauma sheet covering the patient. Heart rate, blood pressure, medication times, oxygen changes. Every update appeared in clean, organized columns exactly where every clinician could see them. Nobody needed a computer anymore. Within seconds, the entire team was working from her handwritten timeline. The chaos shrank. The treatment accelerated. Marcus Hayes watched the transformation in disbelief. 5 minutes earlier, the trauma bay had depended on technology. Now it depended almost entirely on a rookie nurse who seemed strangely comfortable without it. The first major crisis had not defeated her. It had removed everyone else's advantages. Another alarm interrupted the fragile rhythm. The portable monitor flashed a sudden pressure drop. The attending physician reached for medication, then stopped himself halfway through the motion. His eyes shifted toward Emily instead. She checked the patient's neck, watched a single breath, then shook her head. Not medication. She pointed toward the ultrasound machine, now running on emergency power. We fixed the cause. The physician hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. Do it. It was the first direct medical decision he had entrusted to her. Emily performed another focused scan while explaining almost nothing. Her hands remained steady even as another generator warning echoed through the room. She adjusted the patient's position by only a few inches. The pressure stabilized almost immediately. The physician slowly lowered the unopened syringe. Again, he whispered to himself, realizing she had prevented another unnecessary intervention. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. Yet the room had changed. Nurses anticipated her next request before she voiced it. Residents washed her hands instead of the monitors. Marcus Hayes no longer stood over her giving orders. He stood beside the doorway clearing space so nobody interrupted her work. Outside, another urgent transmission arrived. Chief, we have less than 35 minutes before kickoff. Protective command requires an immediate decision. Hayes gripped the radio so tightly his knuckles whitened, but he never answered. His responsibility pulled him toward the stadium. His eyes refused to leave the trauma bay. The federal protective agent quietly set the sealed black case against the wall instead of insisting it be opened. He had come to deliver updated security protocols. Now he was silently carrying intravenous supplies after another nurse's hands became full. No one asked him to help. He simply did. The older paramedic watched all of it with growing disbelief. Then Emily reached toward the supply cart and asked for an item using terminology he had not heard since a joint disaster preparedness exercise years earlier. The words were ordinary to everyone else. To him, they were not. He looked up sharply, studying her face once again. She never noticed. Or perhaps she noticed and chose not to react. Either possibility disturbed him equally. Suddenly, the unconscious Navy SEAL drew a deeper breath than at any point since arriving. His fingers tightened briefly around the blanket instead of Emily's wrist. The portable monitor displayed the strongest readings of the night. It was the first unmistakable sign that he was turning the corner. Relief swept across the trauma bay for less than 2 seconds before the doors burst open again. A stadium security officer rushed inside, pale and breathing hard. He looked directly at Marcus Hayes. "Chief, we have another casualty coming from Liberty Stadium." The officer swallowed before finishing the sentence. "This one is asking for the rookie nurse by name." Marcus Hayes turned toward the exhausted stadium security officer, just as Emily Carter finished securing the last line beside the recovering Navy SEAL. "Who is asking for her?" Hayes demanded. The officer struggled to catch his breath. "A protective detail from the stadium. They said the patient refused treatment until the rookie nurse arrived." Every conversation inside the trauma bay stopped. Emily looked at the unconscious operator first, then toward the hallway. The attending physician immediately understood the choice forming in her mind. If you leave now, he could decline again. Emily checked the monitor one more time before answering. "If I stay here, someone else may never reach this point." It was not confidence. It was responsibility. She quietly handed the patient's chart, still written by hand across the disposable sheet, to the attending physician. "You know what to watch now." The physician accepted it without argument. Hours earlier, he would have dismissed her advice. Now he studied every handwritten note, as though they were instructions left by someone he trusted. Marcus Hayes watched the exchange in silence. Respect had arrived so gradually that nobody noticed the moment it replaced authority. Emily stepped into the hallway with the stadium officer, but she slowed beside a storage alcove where an elderly environmental services employee struggled to push a heavy supply cart through the emergency backup doors. Without hesitation, she stopped, held the door open, helped guide the cart through the narrow opening, and thanked the man before continuing toward the incoming patient. The stadium officer looked confused. "You do not have time for that," Emily answered without breaking stride. Neither did he. The simple act lingered longer than any dramatic speech could have. Hayes noticed it. So did the federal protective agent. Neither man commented. They simply followed her. At the ambulance entrance, another treatment team surrounded a middle-aged stadium operations supervisor who remained conscious but visibly shaken. He kept repeating the same request. "Get Emily Carter." One of the paramedics looked up as she approached. Relief immediately crossed his face. "She is here." Emily knelt beside the patient instead of standing over him. She asked only 3 questions, listened carefully to each answer, then quietly redirected the team away from the obvious injury towards something everyone else had overlooked. The paramedic blinked in surprise before repeating her assessment himself. He reached the same conclusion seconds later. She is right. Nobody celebrated. They simply adjusted the treatment plan. Marcus Hayes had witnessed enough to recognize a pattern. Emily never rushed to prove anyone wrong. She simply kept noticing what everyone else missed. The older paramedic from the trauma bay arrived moments later carrying additional equipment. As he handed Emily a trauma kit, his eyes settled briefly on the careful way she checked every latch before opening it. A memory surfaced. Years ago, during a federal mass casualty exercise, one anonymous instructor had corrected his grip using the exact same silent gesture Emily had just used. He never saw that instructor's face clearly. He only remembered the lesson because it had later saved lives. The realization sent a chill through him. He looked toward the federal agent, who seemed to have recognized the same habit from somewhere entirely different. Neither man spoke. Neither wanted to be the first to guess. Emily completed the immediate treatment, then quietly stepped back so the emergency department team could continue. She had solved the urgent problem, but instead of becoming less necessary, she had become indispensable. Every successful decision placed another expectation upon her shoulders. Marcus Hayes finally approached. "Emily," he said carefully, choosing his words for the first time that day, "I need to ask you something." She met his eyes. Before he could continue, a young hospital volunteer hurried down the hallway carrying a small plastic bag that had been collected with the unconscious Navy SEAL's personal belongings. "Excuse me," she said. "Someone forgot these." As she handed the bag toward Emily, a worn metal identification tag slipped free, struck the polished floor with a sharp metallic sound, and flipped over. Every person standing nearby instinctively looked down. The engraving was old, partially worn away, and impossible to read completely from where they stood, but one small line remained perfectly clear beneath years of scratches. Emily froze for the first time since the day began. The metal tag spun once across the polished floor before stopping against Emily Carter's shoe. At that exact moment, another alarm echoed from the ambulance bay. The recovering Navy SEAL's portable monitor, still connected through the hospital network on emergency backup, showed an abrupt change that pulled every trained eye toward the screen. Emily did not reach for the identification tag. She stepped over it and turned back toward the patient without hesitation. "He is waking up," she said. "Move him before the hallway fills." Nobody questioned her. Marcus Hayes immediately cleared the corridor. The attending physician signaled the transport team. The federal protective agent quietly picked up the fallen tag instead of Emily, slipped it into his palm, and followed the stretcher without opening the bag. Every second mattered more than every answer. As the Navy SEAL regained awareness, confusion crossed his face before recognition settled into his eyes. He searched the crowded room until he found Emily. Ignoring everyone else, he lifted one trembling hand toward her. She stepped close enough for him to hear without forcing him to struggle. "You are safe," she said. His breathing steadied. His shoulders relaxed. The attending physician noticed the change before anyone else. The patient's vital signs improved not because of another medication, but because the panic had disappeared. Emily had chosen reassurance before treatment, and the treatment worked better because of it. Marcus Hayes watched the exchange in silence. The decision she had made hours earlier to refuse his order had preserved the only person capable of identifying weaknesses inside the stadium security operation. Everything he had feared losing by delaying transport had been protected precisely because she refused to compromise her patient. The promise hidden inside her single word, "No," had finally reached its payoff. The federal agent finally unfolded the old identification tag he had retrieved from the floor. Years of wear had erased most of the lettering, but enough remained. He looked down, then slowly looked back at Emily. His expression changed from curiosity to unmistakable respect. Without announcing anything to the room, he quietly handed the tag to Marcus Hayes. Hayes read it once. His jaw tightened. He looked toward Emily, then toward the recovering Navy SEAL, whose eyes never left her. She stayed. The operator whispered weakly. Just like before. No one asked what he meant. They no longer needed the entire story. The fragments they had witnessed all day suddenly fit together. The calm under pressure. The battlefield habits hidden inside ordinary nursing routines. The ability to read a patient before machines could. The instinct to protect life before reputation, authority, or headlines. Marcus slowly returned the tag to the federal agent without reading it aloud. He did not need to. Emily had already proven everything it represented. The older paramedic stepped forward almost unconsciously and straightened his posture. It was not a formal salute. It was something quieter. The kind of respect one professional offers another after recognizing years of unseen experience. Around him, the trauma team began moving differently. Nobody called Emily the rookie anymore. Nobody corrected her. Nobody questioned her judgment. They simply worked beside her. Emily accepted none of it. She adjusted the patient's blanket, thanked the respiratory therapist for catching a loose connection, thanked the resident for preparing fresh supplies, and quietly reminded everyone to focus on the next patient waiting in the hallway. The room realized something unexpected. The most extraordinary person among them was also the least interested in being recognized. Marcus Hayes finally stepped closer. "Emily," he began. She looked up. "The stadium is secure because that man lived," he said softly. "You did not choose between the Navy SEAL and the World Cup final. You saved the only person who could protect both." Emily gave the smallest shake of her head. "I chose the patient in front of me. Nothing more. Nothing less." The words settled over the room with more weight than any medal or commendation could have carried. The federal agent carefully placed the weathered identification tag back into the evidence bag without another word. The secret no longer mattered as much as the woman standing in front of them. Yet before anyone could return to work, a nurse hurried down the corridor holding a tablet that had finally reconnected to the hospital network. She stopped beside Marcus Hayes, staring at the newly restored patient registry with wide eyes before slowly turning the screen toward him. One newly recovered archived record had appeared beside Emily Carter's employee profile, and the moment Marcus read the first line, he realized the truth they had uncovered today was only the beginning. Marcus Hayes lowered the tablet without reading another line. Whatever the archived record contained, it no longer changed the most important fact inside St. Matthew Medical Center. Every person in the emergency department had already witnessed the truth with their own eyes. The attending physician quietly erased the words "rookie nurse" from the assignment board and replaced them with a single name. Emily Carter. Nothing else. No title. No explanation. The simple change rippled through the department more powerfully than any announcement. Nurses who had questioned her only hours earlier now instinctively made room when she walked by. Residents no longer waited to see whether she was right before following her lead. They simply watched carefully, hoping to learn something from the way she observed patients before touching equipment. Emily noticed none of it, or perhaps she simply chose not to acknowledge it. She accepted fresh gloves from a young nurse with a grateful smile, thanked the orderly who had restored power to the portable equipment, and quietly asked whether the waiting family in room 12 had received an update. Her attention remained exactly where it had always been, on the people who still needed help. Across the hall, the Navy SEAL was being transferred to intensive care. Before the transport team rolled him away, he asked for one moment. Emily stepped beside the bed. He reached into the evidence bag resting on his blanket and removed the worn identification tag that had fallen to the floor earlier. Instead of handing it to her, he carefully closed her fingers around the small silver chain she had been wearing beneath her scrub top since the beginning of the day. Then he gently rested his own identification tag beside it for only a second before placing it back into the bag. He never explained the gesture. Emily never asked for one. She simply nodded once, and that silent exchange carried more gratitude than words ever could. Marcus Hayes watched from several feet away without interrupting. The federal protective agent quietly turned toward the doorway, giving them privacy without being asked. In another corner of the emergency department, the older paramedic gathered several new trainees preparing for the evening shift. Instead of beginning with equipment or paperwork, he pointed toward Emily as she knelt beside an elderly patient adjusting a blanket that had slipped from thin shoulders. "Watch carefully," he said softly. "The medicine matters. The person matters more." The trainees followed his eyes. None of them looked at the archived record still glowing on the tablet. They watched the nurse. Outside, the city erupted in celebration as the World Cup final finally kicked off. The cheers drifted through the hospital windows like distant thunder. Inside the emergency department, nobody stopped to watch the match. Life continued one patient at a time. Marcus Hayes slowly approached Emily once she finished speaking with the elderly woman. He extended the visitor credential she had been issued that morning when everyone believed she was only temporary staff. Without saying a word, he replaced it with a permanent hospital identification badge that someone from administration had quietly delivered during the chaos. Emily looked at the badge for a moment before clipping it onto her scrubs. She thanked him with the same calm sincerity she had shown every person that day, whether they had challenged her, supported her, or simply held a door open. There was no triumph in her expression, only relief that another patient had been given another chance. As Marcus stepped away, the young nurse who had first whispered that Emily was only a rookie walked toward the trauma bay carrying a fresh chart. She hesitated for a second before placing it gently beside Emily instead of calling her name across the room. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet everyone nearby understood what had changed. Respect no longer needed to be spoken aloud. Emily accepted the chart, glanced toward the next patient waiting behind the sliding doors, and began walking without looking back. Hours earlier, the first words that echoed through the trauma bay had been, "Forget the Navy SEAL." Now, as the emergency department settled into its steady rhythm once again, every person who had witnessed the day understood the answer hidden inside her quiet refusal. She had never chosen between a championship and a single life. She had simply chosen the patient standing in front of her, exactly as she would choose the next one and the next after that. The stadium lights burned bright across the city, but inside St. Matthew Medical Center another kind of victory had already been won, one that would never appear on a scoreboard, yet would be remembered long after the final whistle faded into silence. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of St. Matthew Medical Center as the night shift quietly gave way to another ordinary day. The television in the waiting room replayed highlights from the World Cup final, celebrating unforgettable goals, impossible saves, and the roar of 70,000 fans. Few people noticed the small emergency department just a few miles away, where another victory had unfolded without cameras, trophies, or applause. The assignment board had already been updated for the new shift. New nurses gathered beneath it before receiving their patient lists. None of them asked who Emily Carter had been yesterday. They simply noticed how every experienced nurse now checked on one another before checking their equipment, how physicians paused to look at patients before looking at monitors, and how the emergency department somehow felt calmer than it had the day before. No one announced a new policy. No one claimed credit. The culture had shifted because one quiet example had proven stronger than 100 instructions. Marcus Hayes returned one last time before leaving for the stadium's post-event briefing. He stopped outside the trauma bay where the day had begun with a single command and a single refusal. The words echoed differently now. He remembered saying, "Forget the Navy SEAL." He remembered hearing one calm answer, "No." At the time, it had sounded like defiance. Now it sounded like the simplest expression of professional duty he had ever witnessed. Without interrupting anyone, he placed a handwritten thank you card inside the charge nurse's mailbox instead of Emily's. It was addressed to the entire emergency department. Every person who had trusted one another had helped save a life. Emily would never have wanted the credit separated from the team. Down the hallway, the older paramedic welcomed another class of trainees. Before beginning the morning briefing, he rearranged the room. The chairs no longer faced the projector first. They faced an empty hospital bed. "This is where every lesson starts," he said quietly. The trainees looked puzzled until he handed each of them a folded blanket instead of a textbook. "Your patient will remember how you made them feel long after they forget your name." No one realized the sentence had been born from watching Emily kneel beside frightened strangers throughout the longest day of his career. In the intensive care unit, the recovering Navy SEAL watched sunlight spread across the floor before asking the bedside nurse a simple question. "Is Emily working today?" The nurse smiled. She never really stopped. He closed his eyes for a moment, grateful enough that no further words were necessary. Emily herself was already back inside the emergency department, helping a frightened little boy choose the brighter bandage after a bicycle accident. She crouched until she was at eye level, handed him the bandage, and let him decide. The boy smiled for the first time since arriving. His mother quietly thanked her. Emily smiled back, wished them a safe ride home, and reached for the next chart before the previous family had fully disappeared through the doors. There was no audience waiting. No cameras followed. The permanent identification badge clipped to her scrubs looked no different from anyone else's. As she walked past the trauma bay where everything had changed, she paused for only a heartbeat to straighten an empty stretcher that had drifted slightly out of place. Then she continued down the hallway toward another patient who needed her. Outside, the city celebrated champions beneath bright banners and fireworks. Inside the hospital, another kind of champion quietly disappeared into another ordinary shift. The difference was that everyone who had crossed her path now carried a small part of her example into the lives they would touch next. Long after the final whistle faded, long after headlines were forgotten, the legacy that remained was not the identity she had hidden or the skills she had mastered. It was the choice she made every single time someone needed help. As another emergency call echoed through the department, Emily Carter looked toward the opening ambulance doors with the same calm expression she had worn at the beginning of the story, took one steady breath, and walked forward. Respect had never followed her because of who she had been. It followed her because of what she chose to do, one patient at a time.